With item number 9, the 2011 appropriation accounts for 36 defence review of allowances. I want to welcome the witnesses and to apologise for the delay in starting this part of the meeting, but we had a meeting this morning with public expenditure and reform officials. Before we begin the meeting, can I remind members and witnesses and those in the public gallery to turn off your mobile phones because they interfere with the sound quality and transmission of the meeting. I want to advise witnesses that you are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the evidence you are to give this committee. If you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise nor make charges against a member of either House, a person outside the House, nor an official, by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of the provision within Standing Order 158 that the committee shall also refrain from inquiring into the merits of policy or policies of the government or a minister of the government or the merits of the objectives of such policies. I want to welcome Michael Howard, Secretary General of the Department of Defence. And can I ask you to introduce your officials, please?
Thank you, Chairman. I'm joined this morning by Mr. Kieran Murphy, Assistant Secretary General, by Ms. Fiona Lafferty, Principal Officer, and Ms. Claire Tiernan, Principal Officer of the Department.
Okay. I want to welcome Colonel Brian O'Keefe, General Secretary of RACO. Can I ask you to introduce your...
Mr. Chairman, this is my Deputy General Secretary, Colonel Adrian Ryan.
And Mr. Jerry Rooney, General Secretary, PDFORRA. You're welcome. Could I ask you to introduce your colleagues, please?
Thank you, Chairman. My Deputy General Secretary of PDFORRA, Mr. Simon Devereux, has accompanied me.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead. Good afternoon. Tom Clark, Department of Public Expenditure and Reform.
Accompanied by Una Buckley, Principal Department of Public Expenditure Reform.
You're welcome again. Opening statements then. Can I ask Mr. Michael Howard, Secretary General, Department of Defence, make your opening statement, please?
Thank you, Chairman. To place today's discussion in an overall context, the expenditure in the defence vote in 2011 was of the order of 700 million gross, of which slightly more than 500 million is accounted for by payroll. During 2011, the numbers employed in the Defence Forces averaged around 9,500. There were 735 civilian employees and 348 civil servants. In nominal terms, the Department of Defence spent a total of roughly 100 million on allowances. However, more than half of this figure, 53 million, is accounted for by Military Service Allowance, or MSA. MSA is a universal payment made to all military personnel to compensate them for the unique demands of military life. MSA is counted as part of the basic pay of military personnel in pay reviews. The balance of roughly 46 million covers allowances as the term is commonly understood, that is, payments that are made selectively to individuals, albeit for very widely varying reasons. The term allowances covers a variety of payment types that are very different from each other. Some are intended to reimburse expenses and do not actually form part of remuneration. Some payments are made in recognition of particular technical or professional qualifications. The Defence Forces have to be self-sufficient. Therefore, in addition to having purely military training and qualifications, the military workforce is extremely diverse, and it includes widely differing skills ranging quite literally from plumbers to pilots. The pay system has evolved different rates of additional pay to reflect this. Finally, there is a range of allowances that seek to recognise particularly onerous duties, whether at home or overseas, and that fall outside the norms taken into account in setting basic pay. I wish to emphasise that military personnel may be required to work around the clock, to work long hours, to remain on duty at weekends. The Defence Forces do not receive overtime, hence this third category of payment. Overall, while there are around 65 separate allowances, it's important to emphasise that many of these allowances are paid to relatively small numbers of personnel. Almost two-thirds of the 46 million is accounted for by the top three categories of allowances. That is, technician pay 7.7 million, security duty allowances roughly 10.5 million, and overseas peace support allowances, again 10.7 million. The tech pay and the security duty allowance had already been selected for review as part of the Defence Sectoral Pro-Park Agreement. Their review has now been subsumed into the larger central initiative and is now being addressed with the representative associations in accordance with agreed procedures. It is also important to emphasise that representation in the Defence Forces is, compared to other areas of the public service, a comparatively recent phenomenon. It was introduced around 1990. Roughly half of the allowances, or 33 of them, date from 1990 or later. This reflects the influence of the associations who identified discrete groups of military personnel performing duties that either impose more than the normal burden on personnel or that require unique qualifications. Many of the allowances apply to quite small numbers of personnel. They frequently address circumstances where military personnel are required to perform duties for exceptionally long periods of time, or where changes in technology require personnel to acquire additional qualifications. For example, an aid to the civil authority allowance compensates personnel who are called out after hours in emergencies such as flooding or bad weather. An EOD allowance is paid to bomb disposal personnel. The committee may also wish to note the ongoing reorganisation, which is a major change in the organisation and structure of the Defence Forces. There have been strength reductions across the board. The reorganisation has had a very major impact on the lives and future careers of serving and future members of the Defence Forces right across the entire organisation. The programme has entailed barrack closures and a large-scale reorganisation process affecting thousands of military personnel. There has been a reduction in the number of brigades from 3 to 2, which will require the redeployment of around 2,000 personnel, and that is in train at present. Throughout this very challenging period, the modernisation process in defence has been overseen by a sectoral implementation group. While very difficult issues have been surfaced and very robust negotiations have been necessary, there has been a continuing constructive engagement by the representative associations at what is a particularly difficult time for their members. The Croke Park Agreement has been adhered to in the most difficult of circumstances, and it has and is being used to facilitate fundamental and far-reaching reform. And I should perhaps add, Chairman, that the Government's recent decision in relation to allowances is now in process, and that I expect the same constructive response, albeit in the context of robust negotiations. Finally, the committee may wish to note that a small portion, less than 2% of the approximately 100 million, refers to allowances payments to civilian employees and civil servants. Pay issues in relation to grades that are employed in more than one department are dealt with centrally. So these grades are not comprehended by the Defence Sectoral Agreement under Croke Park, but they are comprehended by central arrangements. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Burke. Can we publish your statement?
Yes, Chairman.
Colonel Brian O'Keefe, of RACO. Can I have your open statement, please?
Thank you. Chairman and members, on behalf of the Representative Association of Commissioned Officers, RACO, I thank you for the opportunity to address you today. We welcome the opportunity to provide a committee with our perspective on the matter of allowances insofar as they apply to our members. The Defence Force's remuneration structures are a complex mix of pay and allowances. This reflects the complexity of the organisation itself in terms of the spread of skills and expertise of its members and the range of duties performed by personnel across 3 services: Army, Air Corps and Naval Service. The organisation has been described as being like a microcosm of the overall public service. Defence Forces has doctors and nurses, engineers, firemen, pilots, sailors, IT specialists, mechanics, teachers and lecturers, logisticians, carpenters, electricians, lawyers, cooks, accountants and more. Of course, we're also soldiers, sailors and airmen and women with a diverse range of specialised military skills and expertise. We perform a variety of duties on land, sea and air, at home and overseas, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It's inevitable that the remuneration structure for such an organisation will be complex and perhaps difficult to understand. We're not unique in this. Our research indicates that broadly similar structures apply in the armed forces of many other countries, such as the United Kingdom, Finland, Austria, Germany, Denmark, Australia and New Zealand. A range of allowances and additional pay items may be payable to individual members of the Defence Forces, either on an ongoing basis or periodically. These relate either to qualifications, skills or expertise, or to the nature or duration of particular duties performed. In general, our allowances are taxable and not pensionable. A large number have been in place since before representation was introduced to the Defence Forces, while many were introduced or restructured by the Gleeson Commission in 1990. While RACO's preference would generally be for pay increases over allowances, it's rarely been possible for us to address particular remuneration problems other than through allowances. There are many reasons for this, not least the fact that the allowances route is often the most cost-effective one for the official side to take. We note that the recent review of allowances carried out by PDFORRA identified structural weaknesses in the way members of the Defence Forces are paid, and that the Government has decided that new pay arrangements will be developed in the medium term. We look forward to making a significant and positive contribution to the development of more effective structures. However, we do caution that it will not be an easy task. It's not simply a matter of picking a few allowances to consolidate into pay and abandoning the rest. More immediately, the Department of Defence has recently made proposals to withdraw certain allowances from current beneficiaries. Discussions on this matter have opened as part of the process provided by the Croke Park Agreement, and we will engage fully with this process and hope that we can reach a speedy conclusion. My association is totally committed to the letter and spirit of the Croke Park Agreement. The Defence Forces are delivering on all elements of the action plan for our sector. Currently, the most challenging item is the reduction of the number of Army brigades from 3 to 2. Under this reorganisation, many individual members of all ranks face redeployment to new locations or significant retraining to enable them to operate in new roles. They also face a serious reduction in career advancement opportunities through the reduction in appointments. In addition, the change involves a massive effort in administration, logistics and training. The plan for this reorganisation was only finalised in July, but the new organisation will be in place by the 1st of November, with personnel filling posts in their new units. Of course, the retraining and upskilling process will continue way beyond that. The Defence Forces have been described as a model of public service transformation. The evidence of the past 20 years supports this description. Over this period, a process of continuous and radical change has transformed the organisation into one that is acknowledged internationally as being world-class. We've de-layered and fundamentally restructured at every level, significantly reduced the number of barracks occupied, refocused our training, overhauled all of our administrative systems and processes, and brought our equipment right up to date through major re-equipping programmes. These have been funded primarily by payroll savings, achieved through reduction in headcount. From 2001 to 2009, as public service numbers generally increased, the strength of the Defence Forces fell by more than 11%. This resulted in annual payroll savings conservatively estimated at €57 million in current terms. And this followed on from a process in the 1990s that had resulted in a 20% reduction in military numbers during that decade. So that's 28% reduction in numbers since 1990. Chairman, we recognise that the issue of allowances is a serious one and that the overall costs are very significant. However, I do have to say that it has been dispiriting and demoralising for our members to see the considerable attention paid in the media and elsewhere to individual allowances paid to some member of the forces of as little as €27 a year, when there is no coverage of the fact that headcount reductions since 1990 have yielded payroll savings of upwards of €170 million a year. Finally, Chairman and members, I want to thank you once again for the opportunity to address you on this matter.
Can we publish your statement?
Yes, Chairman.
Sherry Rooney of PDFORRA.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the committee. I would like to thank you for extending the opportunity to PDFORRA to come here this morning and outline our position in relation to the allowances that are paid to our members. PDFORRA represents the 8,000 soldiers, sailors and air crew of the Permanent Defence Force on all matters concerning pay and conditions. PDFORRA is established under the Defence Amendment Act 1990 and specifically DFRS 6. PDFORRA negotiates and consults in the main through an agreed conciliation and arbitration scheme. Unlike fully fledged trade unions, PDFORRA or its members have no right to engage in any form of industrial action whatsoever. Moreover, PDFORRA is prevented from joining the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. PDFORRA members receive very modest levels of pay. In the case of the most common rank, that of private, the basic annual rate rises to €34,910 at the top of the scale. In recent years, PDFORRA members have been subject to a reduction in the rates of pay and allowances of approximately 6%, a pension-related deduction of a similar level, and increased tax payments which cumulatively will see some members' pay cut by 20%. Many of our members are struggling to balance family budgets, cope with mortgage debts and payments, and now need family income supplement to survive. The Defence Forces and its members have been delivering significant reform since the mid-1990s, and this process is continuing through the Croke Park Agreement. The numbers have dropped from 12,750 in 1996 to an authorised strength of 9,500 today. The number of barracks has reduced from 29 to 14, representing a 50% decrease, and the organisation has restructured by reducing its administrative and support functions and dropping to a two-brigade structure. As a proportion of GDP, Ireland's defence spending is one of the lowest among the 27 European Union member states at just over 0.5%. The EU average spend as a percentage of GDP is 1.69%. PDFORRA and its members have delivered everything that has been asked of them under the Croke Park Agreement. This has had significant impact on sections of the membership of the same order as the pay cuts and pension-related deductions. For example, the closure of certain barracks and the redeployment of the soldiers concerned to other posts will see them bear additional travel costs of up to €4,000 per annum. This burden will be repeated in the context of the current reorganisation process. At the heart of the Croke Park Agreement is the deal that pay will not be cut in exchange for cooperation and with modernisation and the change agenda. The modernisation and change agenda is being delivered, and therefore pay should not be cut, and this should include allowances. No distinction should be made regarding allowances, as they are simply part of basic or core pay. This is especially the case given the particular circumstances that apply in the Defence Forces. The particular circumstances that I refer to are the fact that members of the Defence Forces do not receive overtime or unsocial hours payments for working additional or unsocial hours. Ordinary members of the Defence Forces who work long and or unsocial hours are rewarded on many occasions, but not all by way of allowances. There are a large number of allowances paid to members of the Defence Forces, and this has attracted a lot of media comment. However, many of the allowances are intended to cover the same thing in different circumstances. For example, in most of the country, additional attendance and unsocial hours are rewarded by the payment of security duty allowance, but in the original border units it was rewarded by border allowance. When additional attendance or unsocial hours are worked in the context of the state's prisons, prison duty allowance is paid, and when it is worked in the context of the explosive ordnance threat, explosive ordnance disposal allowance is paid. Of course, in the Naval Service, patrol duty allowance fulfills this function, while in the Air Corps, flying pay is the relevant allowance. When called on to provide aid to the civil authority, then aid to the civil authority allowance may be paid, and similarly, when that aid to the civil authority arises from industrial action, maintenance of essential service allowance may be paid. Other allowances are also paid to compensate for long and or additional hours of attendance. The allowance bill for all members of Defence Forces amounts to approximately 8.5% of the total pay bill. Historically, these allowances emerged in circumstances where soldiers, sailors and air crew are required to work alongside Gardaí, prison officers, custom officials and local authority workers who received overtime and unsocial hours payments. At that time, the existing pay system did not provide compensation for additional hours of attendance, and the allowances that evolved were an effort to do this without conceding overtime. There are, of course, occasions where no additional payments are made for extra attendance or working on social hours, and those concerned receive no additional payments but may get compensatory time off in lieu. Other allowances paid in the Defence Forces are equally as justified as those already mentioned. Typically, they are paid to individuals who carry out the duties of a higher rank or have a specific skill which is not rewarded through the existing pay structure. It is worth noting that internationally, many armed forces pay out a substantial number of allowances, and that much of this can be attributed to compensation for long and unsocial hours. In summation, I wish to say that the allowance system in the Defence Force is largely driven by a necessity to reward members of the Defence Forces for working long and or unsocial hours without conceding the payment of overtime. The allowances are basic pay and something that our members cannot do without, given the difficult financial circumstances that they now find themselves in. Finally, I would like to thank the Committee for giving PDFORRA the opportunity to put forward the position of our members in respect of their pay and allowances. Thank you, Mr Chairman and members of the Committee.
Thank you, Mr Rooney. Can we publish your statement?
Yes.
I just want to remind members that Mr. Howard here is the accounting officer, and that 11 of the allowances are part of the 88 that we discussed already this morning. So I now open the meeting to Deputy Padal.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to welcome everyone to the meeting. I suppose, to put it in context really, that we're inquiring into the whole area of allowances within the public sector, and I suppose what I want to get from it is a complete understanding, and that we both learn in terms of the exercise, and that we see which allowances are core pay and just generally how they have evolved, and we get an appreciation. I think certainly out there at the moment, I think amongst the general public, I'm not certain people fully, that there's a full, I suppose, detailed knowledge of how the actual structures of the allowances work, how they've evolved over time. And certainly when looking through the allowances, a lot of the lower end ones, I mean, it makes a significant difference in terms of core pay. So I suppose I had a chance to look through the various presentations and the reports, and a couple of striking features to me is that, could you explain to Mr. Howard that how over the years that there's approximately about 100 allowances between, we'll say 65 within the army itself, and about, I think between the civilian and civil service, there's approximately another 35 between them. And how that evolved over time. I mean, I see the first allowance in the army was for the equitation school back in 1922. And I presume that's still functioning. And then there's various other ones up along, and you made reference to the years. So it just would strike me as that a lot of the allowances in the public sector appear to be large in number, quite cumbersome, difficult to comprehend. A lot of them been there for many years, and a lot of them are core pay. So if you could just give us an understanding how that has evolved. Could some of the allowances be amalgamated? And I know you've made reference that there are discussions underway in that area. The other issue is, when I look back, we'll say enlisted personnel, a private now from the 1st of January starts on €220.37 per week. That's below the minimum wage. How has that situation evolved? So is there allowances built into that as well? The basis behind it? The other issue I suppose I wanted to ask on was the allowances. How many of those are built in for pension entitlements? So are they built in? Once again, I'm trying to get around to distinguish between core pay and to distinguish between, we'll say, specific allowances. And two other, and you might, items I'll just throw to you. The level of training within the army. Are the courses and say qualifications that army personnel would do, are they fee tech or heat tech level? Are they at that level? Because generally I think it's something that the type of qualifications they have, if people are leaving the army, we'll say, I think it's 21 years, isn't it, before to get to a point where you can leave. And just generally the type of qualifications. And just a general note, you made reference to the level of, we'll say, reorganisation is taking place within the army, and I suppose this is directed to the representative bodies. How generally is morale within the army at the moment amongst personnel? So maybe Mr. Howard, you could address those. What I want to do really is to get an understanding of how we have effectively 100 allowances within, we'll say, within the Department of Defence, within the Army, and how that has evolved, and why over time were some of those just not reorientated to be core pay.
Okay. Thank you, Deputy. If I could address the general question first, on the basis that sometimes a little inaccuracy and compression could save a ton of explanation. If you take the 100 in total, about a third of them, as you've identified, would apply to grades across the public service. So they would not have been generally admitted. There are one or two of them that are unique to defence.
No, well, 65, I'm just saying. Yeah.
So we can really only speak, but if I can say in relation to the 35 allowances, an awful lot of them would cover the same ground. as are covered for military personnel, so that very often the allowances will be set at a rate which is probably, among other things, influenced by the basic rate of personnel concerned. So if the base rates were different, say civilian employees or civil servants would also have got an allowance, might be roughly equivalent.
Let's then
So
work off to
come back to
65.
the 65, if I can go back to what I said at the start, and maybe elaborate on this a little bit. There are basically a lot of different things called allowance. So, for example, if you take the first one, which accounts for half of the money we spend, military service allowance, at this point, there's probably, after so many years, no harm to the public interest in saying it probably would have been called military service pay and not fallen into the allowance category at all. But for 1979. That's why, as I said, I hope I'm not overturning anybody's position now by saying it, but maybe it's easier just to say it by way of explanation. The reason for that was because of the fear of repercussive effects. In other words, what makes us different from a private sector employer, every public sector employer different, is that everything you go to do, other organisations are watching it, and particularly around that time there was a great fear that if any group got an increase in basic pay that it would spill out into other groups. And this has often informed the way the pay structure has developed. I refer to it as the tyranny of repercussive effects. Everything that we go to do with the representative associations, we don't just have to deal with them, but we have to look left and right and behind us to see that if we give some concession to the defence forces, which may only affect a small number of people, what will the effects be? Now, I just say that in relation. If you go back then to the other allowances, some of the allowances in the defence forces reimburse people for expenses. Of course, there is scope for amalgamation, but I think the important thing to remember here is that if you amalgamate the allowances, you won't necessarily save a whole lot of money because you will still have to reimburse people on some basis. So,
if I just make a quick point,
okay.
The point I'm trying to make here really is that the general public looking in see a figure of 65, right? And the point I'm making is, having had a look through the allowances, and I actually went back to the years they came in and so forth, that it strikes me that it has done a disservice maybe to people working in the army, and that there's a perception out there that there's this myriad of allowances, when in fact you go back, we'll say the military service allowance applies virtually to everyone in the army, and it's there since 1979, it's there over 30 years. Now clearly that's core pay. So the question I'm really asking is, and I understand that, would it not make more sense from, we'll say, in terms of the public viewing in terms of army pay structures, to find a method where a lot of these are, so what you have is you have things that are core pay, deemed to be core pay, and then you have issues that are allowances, but you don't have these, we'll say, large numbers of allowances.
If I could just return to the point of having disposed, if you like, of the expense-related allowances. If you look at the allowances that are paid, they evolved when the associations were established. The associations were established just as pay negotiation was becoming centralised. And once the associations came into that system, they were required to sign up to national pay agreements which provided that only small claims could be submitted. So the only avenue open to the associations to advance a claim if they had a group of people was to make a small claim which was ring-fenced for that group. On the management side, as I've said, we were under what I would call the tyranny of repercussive effects. If the associations brought to our attention a particular group with a problem, we dealt only with that particular group and we isolated it, and it was a cost-containing strategy by management. Now, the price we may have paid for it was administrative complexity, but the alternative might have been, if you had allowances of general application, you did something that could spread beyond our own domain, it could have set off very expensive repercussive effects. So there was, if you like, a rational managerial strategy to contain costs, and we paid a price for it. Part of the difficulty here is that we cannot, for policy reasons, pay overtime. And that is a fundamental, very long-standing policy. It is in the nature of military service personnel have to be available for service 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Because they're in military service, the Working Time Directive and the health and safety legislation provides, they're exempted from it. So when they came in with particular groups, who genuinely, many of them, had merit, we had to deal with them by way of allowance, because it was the only instrument available, and because if we had sought to deal with it under basic pay, the repercussions would have been very serious, and I would put probably against the public interest in the long term. But you are absolutely right in terms of the system that we have now evolved is complex, and there is, in the medium term, scope for amalgamation. But I would caution that it isn't necessarily going to give a very big return in terms of money, because many of these allowances, as you've seen, don't apply to very many people. So
the money factor is obviously huge.
It could be a much better perception could be created.
Looking at the allowance system within the public sector, that it has evolved to be, would strike me as very cumbersome. I would expect it's probably administratively very difficult to administer. I mean, the representative bodies came in about the 1990s. Am I correct in that? Like the military service allowance is there since 1979. So the question I suppose I would ask is, why? That's over 30 years ago, and that's clearly core pay. So why wasn't that, we'll say, amalgamated? Why wasn't that incorporated into core pay? Which that's nearly what, that's the bones of 10 or 12 years prior to the representative.
If I can answer that, there's just 2 points I would like to make. The first is, I would ask the committee in its deliberations to bear this one thing in mind. What has gone on in the public service generally and what has gone on in the defence forces are different things. An awful lot of things that we have to address through allowances are addressed elsewhere in the scheme of overtime or other payments. So it isn't fair to the defence forces to compare the number of allowances with an employment where overtime is available. So I think, okay, but just the second point in relation to military service.
I wouldn't. I'm not doing that.
Oh, I said that, but I just want
you're saying something there that we haven't said.
Oh, I'm not trying to misattribute anything, but I'm just trying to make clear the people.
I'm asking. No, and I wouldn't, because clearly, looking at the allowances, the army is relatively unique amongst departments where there isn't overtime. Okay, so no, I'm asking. What I'm looking at here is to get an understanding in terms of we'll say, why the military service allowance makes up, it's nearly 53 million, right? It's 8,700 of the army staff. So effectively, the bulk of the staff qualify for it. Yeah, and the question I suppose I'm asking really is that when the figure was put out, it was put out as including that when it's clearly core pay. So the question is, why wasn't that incorporated as core pay, would say relatively within the 10 years prior to representative being formed?
I preface this by saying is that I know I shouldn't discuss any of the negotiating positions we may take in the future, but with the latitude of the chair, I can assure you that we still won't be trying to amalgamate it into core pay, because there are unique conditions of military life. People are subject to military discipline. They are liable for service 24/7. They are exempted from certain protections that other employees have because of the hazards of military life. We have to recognise that in their basic pay because it's universal for all of them, but we must do so in a way that's ring-fenced, so somebody else, somewhere else, cannot say, I'm an electrician. A soldier who's an electrician gets paid more than I do. We have to have that element of the soldier's pay that is unique to the army clearly identified. Now, the only thing I would say is that I do accept the point that you're making about, in the future, the scope for amalgamation, and I do accept the fact that from a presentational point of view, this is very difficult for somebody who comes to it from the first point, for the first time. And I would just hope that the committee would understand that sometimes you evolve a situation like this because we can only address our business within the policies and the constraints that bind us. And within that context, the associations arrived on the scene representing a workforce that had never had the right of representation before. They naturally had a lot of issues. We dealt with them this way because it was the only way we could deal with them, but neither could we refuse to hear them, because they did make the point at that time, and I believe reasonably, that they had never had an opportunity before to go to any forum with a pay claim of any kind. And just when they arrived, the era of making individual pay claims was over. So they did have specific issues. So we dealt with them as we did. It may not have been ideal, but within the constraints we had, it was the only way that we could. But in the different situation we're in now, quite obviously going forward, I mean, you're absolutely right. There is scope for amalgamation.
I'm making the context in terms of the private or the officer working in the army, the perception might be that there's this myriad of allowances when it would strike me a lot more core pay.
Yeah.
That's purely the basis I'm coming from.
Could I add perhaps just one other point of information about the rationale? If you look at the military payroll in the round, the pay and the allowances, it does tend to operate in a way that the soldier or the officer who acquires more qualifications, who volunteers or makes himself available for difficult or demanding duties, at the end of the year, they will have earned more in the year. And that is also a rational objective. In other words, where we had some discretion and some money available, it has tended to be channeled towards people who have served overseas, who are doing security duty allowance, regarding Portlaoise prison and all that, and that. So, if you like, the discretionary element of the payroll has, I hope, tended to reward people who are doing onerous duties.
Just the two other issues. The issue in terms of the qualifications of the HETEC, VTEC, HETEC, and also the issue in terms of, I two other questions. The starting pay for a private would strike me as very low at €220.37.
Starting pay, and again, by the way, I appreciate in terms of the complexity of our system. The figure that I have is for a recruit on enlistment, including the military service allowance, with 286.43. Now, that rises fairly quickly. It's effectively a training allowance. Like within 12 months, the recruit will see an increase to 336, and then 2 years service 432.
43 year one and year two.
Okay. So yeah, my attention has also been drawn to the fact that, of course, that's an apprentice, which would be, I don't think, well, it's a different scheme, because when we took in apprentices, we tended to take in apprentices as part of a training school. We have tended not to do that in recent times. So basically, yeah.
Someone starting would say...
If we had somebody start, they would go from 286 to 412.72 relatively quickly on completion of basic training.
Okay, so that's starting. And
yes.
It is, I mean, it would strike me as, we'll say, 286.42. I mean, it's still below the minimum wage, right? And just to give me, like, what I want to be here is I want to be fair. So I just, and the public interest.
Yeah, just in that context, that is only paid to people when they're in training. Effectively, it's a training allowance. Okay. When they complete the training, they go on to the higher rate.
Okay.
That is to say, 412.72, which includes the military service allowance.
And the VTEC and HETEC, just the qualifications.
If you're happy, we will send you a more detailed note on it. The general point in relation to this, there has been an awful lot of work done in the Defence Forces in terms of professionalising and organising training in a formal way, and an awful lot of military courses now do get accreditation. I don't have any details with me, so if you're happy, I can get you more in relation to that.
Okay. Can I just ask the representative bodies in terms of, we'll say, the reorganisation of the army? Generally, what's your general perception amongst your members, your general feeling amongst your members in terms of army morale? Where stands the body of men and women in the army? How they view the whole process at the moment?
Well, I think certainly from the point of view of PDFORRA's membership, there's probably a number of things, but there is a certain exhaustion with reorganisation in it. So certainly since the mid-90s, it's a continuous wave of reorganisation. So that has created a certain dissatisfaction in reorganisation around that. The other issue, obviously, is the modern day issues of people being unhappy in terms of their current financial position. Pay cuts have affected that. And I think also people are affected by, a bit like you pointed out, that there is a misunderstanding perhaps of the organisation in terms of the public. So, I mean, there has to be a continuous retelling of the allowance system, why they would be paid, and it does wear people down, I suppose.
To ask you your overall view, the argument will say, the point I put to Mr. Howard will say allowances versus core pay and the structure within the army in terms of regarding, how do you view, will say, core pay? I know obviously the discussion's ongoing, but can you just give me a sense of flavour of where you see the whole issue of allowances, the pay being given in the form of allowances as distinct from core pay, or is it unique to the Army, and just your general overview on that?
I wouldn't say it's unique, but I'd say some of the circumstances that it is paid in is unique because we aren't an overtime organisation, and that in itself, I think, creates a grievance among the membership, and who would then say, because we don't get overtime, we're being criticised for having a series of allowances that does that. So I think collectively it creates that. They would like that certainly cleared up, and obviously the view is that those allowances are core pay because that's what they're rewarding people for. But it has created certainly an undoubted sense of grievance, and that's contributed, I think, to lower morale.
I think the difficulty with allowances from our point of view is that generally they're not pensionable. So, there's no long-term benefit for the members. Now, that is changing in the new pension scheme for new entrants.
Sorry, sorry, Mr.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. The military service allowance,
Yes.
are the main, we'll say, an indication, we got an idea of, we'll say, the top 10 allowances. Would many of those be pensionable? Or military service allowance, is that pensionable?
None of them, with the exception of military service allowance, there might be 2 other allowances paid to very small numbers for officers that are pensionable. Military service allowance is the main one. And if I could, I might throw some light on why it wasn't amalgamated into pay. Yeah. It wasn't pensionable until 1990. And when it was made pensionable, it was only made pensionable for people who were in receipt of it from 1990 forward. So it was only made pensionable for people who were in receipt of it from 1990 forward.
Oh, okay.
So if it had been amalgamated before that, of course, the pension of retired personnel would have increased.
Okay.
That's why it was done.
Okay. Okay. Mr. Howard, you obviously want to come back in. Just, it was actually a question I put, Mr. Howard, earlier about the pensionability allowance.
If you take I think the list of 10 that we are discussing with the association, obviously we won't go into it, but one of them, the border duty allowance, is the only one that's pensionable. In general, for personnel serving at the present time, the allowances tend not to be pensionable. There are some exceptions to that. The MSA, the military service allowance, is pensionable, as Colonel O'Keefe has said.
The greater majority of the allowances are not pensionable. Sorry, numerically.
Well, again, I'm just at risk. I don't want to accidentally oversimplify things in that Colonel O'Keefe adverted to the existence of new pension arrangements for people who come in post-2004. What I've said is that for the majority of personnel serving at the time, at right now, the great majority are not pensionable. I wonder, Chairman, if it would be better if we wrote a note to you on this specific issue, because I'm just afraid I might accidentally misdirect the committee.
And I'll finish on one point, just by way of when I was looking through the allowances, I noticed some of the allowances, no payments have been made even though they're there yet. So, for instance, there's an allowance there came in 1937, a ration allowance for cadets. There was nothing paid in it last year. There was a uniform allowance for cadets. It came in 1939. There was nothing paid. There is the other one. There was a search and rescue allowance. Came in on the 1st of the 1st, 1997. There was nothing paid in it. And then, can you explain to me as to why we'll say? And then there was a children's allowance, AWOL, nothing paid. How are they, if there was nothing paid in them, you might explain to me.
The reason, by the way, the general reason is the circumstances didn't give rise.
Sorry, you might actually, on the latter one I just called, you might tell me exactly what it is.
If a soldier goes absent without leave, his pay stops. So there is an allowance whereby if his children, his wife and children are left bereft without pay, there is a provision to make a payment. So the reason it hasn't been paid is the circumstances have arisen. Regarding the others, I mean,
nobody has actually gone AWOL, or at least
for long enough,
Mr. Howard, what about if the wife goes AWOL?
That's the same.
A lot of people under a lot of pressure.
They're men.
Sorry.
Yes, yeah, be careful.
I know there's an allowance in there for women as well. This it's not the subject of discussion today. I think it's prohibited. It's in one of the 11 allowances to go. So I think, yeah. Look, I'm making the point really, a general point, and I very much take on board Deputy MacDonald. I was about to conclude by saying women and men. So, yeah.
The other allowances they've mentioned, I mean, some of them are legacy allowances that haven't paid because the circumstances that gave rise to them simply didn't happen in the course of the year. For example, search and rescue is an allowance that was paid to personnel involved in air search and rescue. That has been privatised by the Coast Guard, so the duty no longer arises. Simply for completeness, it has been included in all the submissions because it still exists on the regulations, but it is a legacy and nobody is being paid it. And similarly, the rations is a form of compensation, I think, for circumstances. If somebody was out, they should have been fed and they weren't. I think army catering arrangements, no matter what has given rise to difficulty in my years, so
In terms
they
of
have
change,
become obsolete.
Some of them will become obsolete. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd do like to welcome representatives of the representative organisations and Mr Howard and his colleagues for this very important discussion. It never ceases to amaze me the low level of pay enjoyed by privates in particular, and oftentimes how long it takes somebody to reach the middle end of the scale. And I think it's important to look at the discussions that we're having this morning around allowances in the context of low pay. The general issue of low pay is a discussion for another day. We're here to discuss allowances. The representatives may be able to assist me in informing the meeting how long training takes for an enlisted private. That's the first question. And I'm going to pose a series of questions. I'll be happy if you answer them one by one. Maybe PDFORRA may be in a position to best answer on that one.
Well, typically the initial basic training is about 16 weeks. And then there's a second period of training, which could, again, be about 10 weeks in addition to that. So, and one, after a period of leave, follows the other. So the basic training should be out of the way within the first 6 months.
Really after about 2 years service, the general, now excluding allowances, the core pay, if I can put it like that for the purposes of this conversation, still only reaches about €391.06 or something like that. Not much above. It's around about the national minimum wage.
Yeah, I think, well, after training and you're appointed to a fully trained soldier, first point of the scale, this is before the rates were cut. It's 474 was the rate, so it's low, but it is
before the rates were cut.
Yeah.
Okay. Just in the border area, and it was around, I think, about €5 million paid for border duty allowance, and I have some understanding of the border duty allowance in the context of the area in which I was born and reared in the constituency I represent of County Louth. I understand how important it is for Defence Force members in that area, in my own area. How long has the border allowance been in place, and is it the case that if a member of the Defence Forces is in receipt of the border allowance, that they forego or aren't paid the military service allowance? Is that the case?
No, it's security duty allowance that they forgo. It's a separate allowance, but they're paid MSA and border allowance.
Border duty allowance for enlisted personnel is €96.23. So even if you're in the middle of the sort of grade, if I can put it like that, that's probably about maybe 15 to 20% of your pay. So it's very substantial. It's very significant for a family. I suppose, ironically, in many incidents, members of the Defence Forces are accompanying members of the emergency services for particular duties, accompanying members of the emergency services who themselves enjoy overtime and various other allowances. Well, in fact, members of the Defence Forces don't. So I can understand entirely, and it's very useful, the light shone on it by Mr Howard in terms of how how that matter is addressed, in terms of, given the fact that members of the Defence Forces can't receive overtime, that it's made up through a series of allowances. It's very useful just from the point of view of our own discussions and putting that in context. How does the allowance structure and the pay structure in general in the Defence Forces compare internationally, say for example with our nearest neighbours, the United Kingdom?
Obviously, we only have what I would call an outsider's knowledge of what goes on internationally. I would say that from what we know, most armed forces have to deal with the same issue that we have to deal with, which, if I can put it in simple terms, the entire civilian world is almost replicated within the Defence Forces with all of its diversity of remuneration. Because the Army has to be self-sufficient, it has to do for itself things any other organisation would call an outsider in. When we deploy troops to Lebanon or to Chad, they have to go out there with carpenters, plumbers, electricians, emergency medical technicians, a whole load of people like that. All other armies face the same issue, and generally speaking, they have systems of allowances or additional pay to take account of it, so that they all have the same issue that they have some form of basic or line pay to do with your rank, and then they have other payments they make to do with particular skills, because, for example, every Air Force in the world has to pay pilots more than it pays other officers of the same rank, or they wouldn't be able to keep a pilot in the place. Similarly for professional officers like engineers. Similarly, among other personnel, we have a lot of trade-trained craftsmen of a very high level of skill, mechanics, technicians and people like that, and that has to be recognised. So to give you a general broad brush answer, our pay system, while it's unique in detail, at the level of principle, it addresses the same problem in an equivalent way to other countries.
The experience of RACO, for example, on PDFORRA. I'm assuming that you meet regularly with colleague organisations internationally.
We do, and we've done a lot of work on this. And internationally, it's common that pay structures are quite complex, a lot of allowances. Some armies pay overtime. But then the experience is that if you're on exercise with those armies, when a certain time comes, the exercise stops, because otherwise they'll be running into overtime. That's not a situation we'd like to see happening here, I think.
A couple more points. Just text of the reorganisation that you very well articulated earlier on, and some of the challenges that has presented for Defence Force members and for the system in general. Has this turned up any additional costs that you've identified for your own members and for members of the Defence Forces, personal costs for them that aren't maybe catered for through the pay structures that are in place at the moment?
Well, certainly in the longer term, the reorganisation is leading to the deployment of staff around the country to different locations. And initially there is an allowance paid for a 9-month period to defray some of that. But after the 9-month period, any additional costs arising from commuting are borne by the person doing the commuting. And it's some of the distances that are involved are substantial. So the figure of 4,000 might be conservative in some cases, as I mentioned earlier. But you know, that's certainly an issue that we're dealing a lot with people coming forward.
Obviously, in the context of the Croke Park Agreement, there's a restriction in terms of the, if you're redeployed to another town, city, village, whatever the case might be, it must be within a 45-kilometre radius. That doesn't apply clearly to the Defence Forces, given what I know and what we're all aware of in terms of barracks closures and the obligation for a member of Defence Forces to move. Clearly, the structure is based on very strict discipline and very strict order, and that's the way it should be. So that must create some challenges and must have impacted on morale as well.
Well, it certainly contributed to it. Is that they, as I said, there's been a lot of reorganisation, but now people are facing quite considerable disruption. Yes, but considerable disruption and the associated additional costs. So it's certainly contributed to that lowering of morale. There's no question of that.
I'm very, very struck, and I have experience of this myself in terms of members of the Defence Forces that I represent as a Dáil deputy. Very struck by your reference, Mr. Rooney, to the reliance of Defence Forces members, in some cases, on family income supplement. I think that is something that is extraordinary and something that we need to reflect on in the Oireachtas as well. Would you agree, and would you have the view that if a decision was taken to, for example, remove the border allowance or any other allowance that would, in my opinion, form part of core pay, that it would in some respects be a false economy in terms of the identification of savings by the department and by government in general, because ultimately responsibility would fall on the Department of Social Protection to make up the difference and to provide some sort of reasonable living income for a family. Now, I find that frankly objectionable and unconscionable for a member of the Defence Forces of our country, people who we depend on to keep us safe and secure, that they have to depend on family income supplement to survive. Would you believe that's a false economy if a decision was taken to remove, for example, a border allowance of €96.23, that the focus would then, I understand that, I'm looking for the view of PDFORRA on that, because you're dealing with it every day.
Yes, because not only would there'd be greater instance of people claiming family income supplement. But within the Defence Forces, you're precluded from claiming security duty allowance while you claim border allowance. So if you no longer received it, you have the increased costs associated with security duty allowance, as well as any wider costs like family income supplement.
Just a final question, Chairman, and obviously the role of the Defence Forces has changed, and we've discussed to a point the reorganisation. Do both representative organisations believe that there is a compelling case of sorts to consolidate the sort of allowances that we're aware of that have been built up over the years into a sort of consolidated, renewed pay structure? And if there are any pitfalls there for your members, could you identify them for me?
I think there is some scope to consolidate some allowances, but not many, I have to say, for the very reasons that Mr. Howard outlined, that some duties are not performed by all personnel. All personnel don't have all qualifications, so how would you pay a balanced amount to all personnel? But there is some rationalisation that would be possible, and we did some of that in 1998, where we consolidated some officers' allowances into 3 bands of pay. So now you have not just pay by rank, but pay by band, professional classification. So you could have 3 captains of different types, each of them paid differently. And that is common in other armies. The British Army in particular have done that pay banding in lieu of some allowances. So there's some scope for that, but not a whole lot, I would say. But we certainly look forward to the review, and we will be entering into it enthusiastically.
Broadly, similar to RACO, I mean, the issue about moving to banding is say if you take, for example, technician pay, there's 6 bands currently. So if you go to a smaller number of bands, where exactly they lie, obviously, and then into which band each occupation goes,
it's longer to reach the next sort of increment, if I can use that.
So there are the challenges. Yeah.
Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and you're all very welcome here this morning. I just have a series of questions that I'd like to go through one by one with you, but I'll just start off by making a point that I think the format that we decided upon, Chairman, of having the representatives of the employees, so to speak, sitting alongside the employers, I think has, shows this is going to be a fruitful way of looking at the issue. Because I think if we'd ended up in a situation where we'd only heard one voice in relation to it, or we had heard each voice but at separate times, I think we would have missed the point. And I very much hope this is something that we can replicate when we go through them all. Go through all our hearings. My first question just relates to some information that was shared to us by the Department of Defence, which was when we asked to set out the percentage of total compensation that it consists of basic pay and then core and then allowances. And if possible, could we just put that up on the screen for the purposes of discussion? It's question 2 and question 3 that was answered. And while our colleague is just displaying that, I'll just read out what some of the figures are, and I'd like each of the parties then just to comment and give me your views on the figures that we've heard. I'll use it for enlisted personnel just to make the point, but the same trend exists for officers as well. Do we have that there? No, it's this one here that has the question 2 and 3 on it.
Sent it by way of email last night.
Do we have that one there?
No.
Yeah, that's it.
That's it, yeah.
It's just the next page.
Next page. Next page. That's the one, yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you could just go down to the middle one, which is the enlisted personnel, please. Yeah. Okay. We just ask you to comment on the fact that for the people who are at the lower end of the wage scale, going up to the middle end of the wage scale, that their allowances occupy a far bigger percentage of their total income than it will be for people who are higher up the scale. So, for example, between private and sergeant, it's between 8.9 to 12.5% of their total compensation. But if you go up to a sergeant major, it nearly halves, and then gets considerably smaller when you go up into officer rank. So if I could maybe ask Mr. Rooney just to give any observations in relation to that table, and then ask maybe if Colonel O'Keefe would do the same.
Well, I would have thought the justification, for those the ranks from private to sergeant is essentially they are the operational workers. It's not that the other groups don't obviously carry out operational work, but I mean the large bulk of it would be carried out by those people. So they probably are the main group who are on a day-to-day basis, perhaps working additional hours or on social hours, and that's the reason why they would be.
And Colonel O'Keefe?
Yeah, I think it reflects the pyramid that is the military structure. Yeah. There's a lot of soldiers at the bottom and fewer as you go up. Also, from the rank of commandant up would not be regarded as overtime grades, or their equivalents wouldn't. So they wouldn't be in receipt of security duty allowance at all.
Okay. I mean, I'm asking this because the detail is where all of this lies in. I mean, it's very easy to make observations at top-line level, as I've done myself. But it's when you get into the real detail of this that you begin to understand the picture. And if I could just go back to the comment that you made there, Mr. Rooney, you were saying there that because many of the allowances are operational related, and then because most of those operations are concentrated out at the kind of mid to lower end of the salary scale, that's the reason why a higher percentage of the total compensation is taken at, let's say, private or sergeant level. Have I understood that point correctly?
Yes.
Okay. And Mr. Howard, would you have any observations in relation to a table like this?
Yeah, simply just to repeat what I think I have already said, that the effect of many of the allowances is to increase the earnings of those who do operational duties, so that if you look at the structure of, say, an infantry battalion serving overseas, it will have an awful lot of infantry privates in it, and they will be paid an allowance for serving overseas. If you look at something like a cash or prisoner escort, there will be a small number of senior people in charge and a much larger number of private soldiers. So this is exactly what we would expect from the structure of the pay system that we have.
Well, and I want to compliment the Department of Defence for providing a table like this with such detail. And I very much hope that when all your corresponding departments come in, they can do the same. Because there are other parts of the public service that I want to understand this very point. Because I think it goes to the core of the whole debate regarding allowances, what they're there for and who's getting them. And a discussion like this is certainly helping me understand that a bit more. Just to move it on a bit, looking for my list of questions and I couldn't find the page, I've got it now. I'd just like to put it to you that maybe one of the issues that we're facing here is that the phrase allowance covers off such a disparate amount of different things, for really everybody we're talking about here. And I'll just give an example of it. You provided a very helpful document to us that listed every single allowance that goes into Defence Forces, and the 65 of them. And for example, that list, and I'm not going to go into the figures for some of them for a reason, but for example, that list has on it the allowance that's paid to somebody who's a ranger. It has on it the allowance to somebody who's removing a device that could be explosive. But it also on the same list has, for example, the underwear and night attire allowance, and it has the editor's connect and custom tour allowance. And I'd just like to put it to you that this could be part of the difficulty where we're all trying to get our way through here. That because they're all seen as allowances, it kind of introduces kind of parity that says, but that allowance, that activity is the same as the other activity, whereas, of course, they're not at all. I mean, somebody who's removing something that could be a bomb, that's a very different kind of work to somebody who's editing a magazine, for example. Do you have any kind of observations in relation to that point?
I would agree with you, Deputy, and I think it's compounded by the fact that the public generally don't understand the work of the Defence Forces. They don't understand the organisation of it, what we do, and that makes it very difficult, of course. So when they see a list of allowances, they can't relate it to what it's actually for. And that has caused us huge difficulties. And as I say, I think it has been very damaging to the morale of the Defence Force over the last year or so, the vilification of the public sector and particularly of the Defence Force when you see certain allowances in lights, shall we say.
Okay, and could I just drill into this with a specific example, which is one I came across there, which is the allowance in relation to the Army Medical Corps, okay, where it says here, for example, if you are a senior surgeon in the Army Military Corps, you get paid an allowance. Now that appears to me to make eminent sense, given the environment within which some of your surgeons could be operating. But why is that an allowance? Because if you were in other, I know you don't like the comparison private public because there's no private army, so you can't make the analogy. But I think a useful analogy was if you were doing a more demanding job in very difficult circumstances, you just get paid extra for it. And it's not an allowance, though. It's like an extra salary in compensation of the fact that you're doing a difficult job. So how is something like that, how have we got to the point that something like that is seen as an allowance?
That one's historical. I mean, we don't have surgeons at the moment. There's one, but they're...
Yeah. I was about to say that going back to the points we were making earlier about some of the allowances that are almost saying that there is one person, I think, who gets it for being in charge of a military hospital, of which we've one. So that it is, to some degree, it's an allowance whose time has passed. But
yeah,
I
would make the same point, for example, in relation to air traffic controllers.
Sure.
And there's 19 of them.
Yes.
And it's this point here that, for example, somebody who is running a watch supervisor, for example,
sure,
and there's a few of them, they're getting paid extra because that's an extra job, so to speak. It's a demanding job to do.
I think the Deputy has made actually what is a very valuable point that we will have to take into account ourselves, is not just the need to rationalise and amalgamate. The truth of the matter is that many of these payments have got titles that nobody gave any thought to it at the time because nobody foresaw the debate in public that is now taking place. And you're absolutely right. If we were to go back over this list now with the wisdom of what has happened over the last few years, I think we'd be rebadging an awful lot of the allowances. And by the way, when we engage with the association in the medium term, I expect there will be some scope for amalgamation. But I think, as Colonel O'Keefe has pointed out, we can only make the system of pay as simple as possible. We can't make it any simpler than it needs to be. But I do agree that from the point of view of what is called an allowance, no particular thought was needed in naming these payments when they were being established. A lot of thought might have gone into the conditions under which they would be paid, but what you actually call the allowance wouldn't have been an issue that people reflected on, I think, to any great degree. And unfortunately, completely unforeseeable, it has landed us in the situation we're in now. And I think all of us would probably share, although we have very different opinions maybe about where to go at times, the fact that the public debate on this has taken place perhaps on the basis of very little knowledge. And that has been, I think, unfortunate for the Defence Forces and for the personnel.
Rooney, would you have any comment on that point?
Oh,
no. Yeah. And like, for example, it appears to me the best example of this thing is the military service allowance. Like, which is paid to people for their work over time based on the number of years in which they do the work. But that isn't, I would just argue, having considered the detail of this now and haven't seen it, that isn't an allowance. That is work that somebody gets paid for doing a particular kind of work well over a period of time, and they get paid a bit more for doing it.
The military service allowance, for example, in other countries, it's termed differently. In Britain, it's called the X factor, and it's factored into the composition of the X factor.
The X factor.
X factor.
Well, I tell you, I strongly suggest we don't rename it to that. Could land us in a whole lot of other difficulties.
It's an integral part of the pay. In Canada, it's called the military factor, and again, it's not a separate allowance; it's just built into pay. New Zealand, it's core pay, and New Zealand is the same. It's called the military factor, and it's an element of pay, the basic pay package.
Well, and just to end then on a different point, I think if we were to draw a graph, right, that had the value of the allowance and the number of people earning it, it'd have a very, very long tail in that as you start off up here and then it would slope off to a very low value of allowance with very, very few people earning it. But I would just put it to you that I think it's the length of that tail that's getting us into some of the difficulty we're in at the moment. And I'll just give you an example of it here. I could pick out a few here. I saw one there a moment ago, the isolated outpost allowance, for example. Like, where is that now? Yeah, here we go. Isolated outpost allowance is number 26. And 78 people are in claiming of it, which is, you know, a small number in the context of the total number of people in the Defence Forces. But something like that for me is what's crying out then to be reclassified kind of as part of the whole core pay. Because, like, I would look at, you know, working in you're nodding your heads? No? No? Well, I'm just interested in this. Like, I would look at something like this and say, like, an isolated I think I'm going to call it outburst allowance, but it's outpost allowance. I think isolated outbursts are confined to, you know, maybe, anyway, I won't go into that. Like, how do we handle something like that? Because, like, some people would look at that and say, you know, that's just part of being in the army. You're going to be working in places when nobody else is around for long periods of time, and you shouldn't get paid extra for that. Well, what would your response be to something like that?
I suppose the outposts are not so isolated anymore. They were when this was introduced, and it wasn't really for that allowance. Wasn't for work done. It was to compensate people for the fact that there was no support structures to provide meals, etc. So it was the cost of providing a meal for themselves. Now, of course, there would be another way of doing that.
So the cost of them providing meals for themselves. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Mr. Howard, yeah?
Sorry, just to be clarified, you see, all of these things, no matter how they look, sometimes when you take the title, they often have a rationale, which was basically when the basis of the pay system historically was that soldiers joined up, lived in barracks, and were fed and provided for. If they were permanently placed in a situation where they could not be provided for, they were given a payment in lieu. Now, the point about, I mean, as communicated, we won't negotiate this, obviously, in a public place, and we have to have a discussion. I mean, obviously...
Is this 188?
No.
No, okay.
But we do have a medium-term review to undertake construction. We would address it in that context. But the point of people, if they are away, if they're in a situation where they have to provide meals for themselves because of their work, there are travel and subsistence allowances that apply generally to all public servants. So the big danger from our point of view is that you need to understand why this is paid, in what conditions it's paid, because you don't wish to have a situation whereby abolishing an allowance that is ring-fenced, you create a more general problem. So I would just ask people not to jump to the conclusion about the allowance simply because it may have a rather archaic title.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Thank you for that.
Deputy Harris.
Thank you to Mr. Howard and Colonel O'Keefe and Mr. Rooney and all your colleagues for being here today. I think, again, just to pick up on the point Deputy Donoghue made, I think, Chairman, this is a very useful process, and I think it's actually a good reflection on the Oireachtas. I think one of the criticisms of the likes of social partnership in the past, or in previous years, was how the Oireachtas was never allowed to comment about social partnership or public sector reform, and everything was done kind of behind closed doors and then announcements made with much fanfare. And I think this is a much healthier process, and whilst we don't make the decisions and whilst negotiations do have to and must have to continue in private, I think we can make a positive and constructive contribution to it. And I also think having the representative bodies here is particularly useful as well, so thank you very much for being here. I mean, I think Deputy Donoghue put his finger on it. It's the fact that we're calling these allowances is really the problem. And from looking through the allowances across the public sector, and particularly in relation to yourselves and the Department of Defence today, I mean, I think they really break down into three categories. One, they're not allowances. One category is expenses. It's money that's reimbursed to people for expenses they incur in doing their job. I think most people, again, once that's within a reasonable nature, understand that. I think the second is what we should be trying to do in the public sector, and it's what they do in the private sector, is when somebody carries out an additional task or an additional responsibility or obtains an additional skill, they get an extra payment for it. And I think there's a number of them in relation to the Defence Force, and colleagues have referred to them. I think the third one is probably the difficulty, and you could probably broadly class as other. And in my view, I suppose it's the failure of public policy to actually grasp the nettle of public sector pay, particularly in relation to the Defence Forces. And I would actually go so far as to say to both RECO and PDFORRA that I think our Defence Forces have actually been badly served by a breakdown in public service policy, which has, and I learned a new phrase from Mr. Howard today, and it's never a bad day when you learn a new phrase, but the tyranny of repercussive effects, which I might explore with you in a moment, because I think that says an awful lot about, I think it said an awful lot about how our policy has evolved in relation to dealing with public sector. Because if I can actually start with this, Mr. Howard, if I take from that we have a situation where we have a paralysis within the public sector, where we can't actually address the pay needs, the legitimate pay needs of some members of our defence forces who are earning ridiculously low sums of money, for fear that that will have some sort of knock-on domino effect, and we'll have everyone in the public sector jumping up and down looking for more money. Am I representing what you said correctly, firstly, I suppose?
I was describing a historical situation, Deputy.
Sure.
I would want to make very clear. I was explaining what had happened prior to the situation that we're in now. Now, I would have to say, just again, for the general guidance of the committee, without going too far outside what would be proper for me to comment on, I've worked in this area for a very long time. I would have been around during the 1990s and 2000s for pay agreements. I have to say that, in fairness, the current pay agreement, Croke Park, and I offer this as an empirical observation, facilitates change and flexibility in a way that no previous agreement did. I was describing the situation as it was then, while the allowances were being built up. It is no longer the position.
Absolutely, and I think what's after happening, I'm in agreement with you. I mean, what's basically after happening, rather than what I'd politically, I suppose, call Bertie economics, rather than actually addressing basic public sector pay, we introduced a whole lot of allowances to basically meet the legitimate expectations of people doing, in many cases, a dangerous and very important job in our country. So I just make that as a point. However, having said that, I don't think that's a defence for continuing some allowances going forward, and I do think you've talked, particularly Colonel O'Keefe, about incorporation of allowances into pay. And can I just to kind of reiterate the stance of both RECO and PDFORRA in relation to that? You talked about there is some scope. Could you just maybe expand on where you see that scope? Not asking you to again negotiate in public, but just where you see that scope for incorporating allowances into pay.
Where there are large groups of people in receipt of an allowance. If you take, for example, flying pay, which is down as an allowance, that's clearly an element of pay for our pilots. And so you could make another band of pay where we have 3 at the moment. There could be a 4th, flying officers' pay. That's just one example.
That's helpful. Mr. Rooney, would you have a similar view?
It'd be broadly similar positions for the same. If there is flying pay paid to our members as well, similar circumstances, and it should be properly seen as core pay.
Very broad public agreement on that point as well. And Mr. Howard, I suppose we've had an awful lot of focus in relation to the allowances, particularly relating to the Defence Forces. Can I just return to some of the allowances relating to staff within the Department of Defence, which I suppose again are replicas of allowances that probably exist right across the public sector and right across all departments. I think when you talk to my colleague Deputy Donoghue about the need for rebranding, I mean, if I could give one piece of advice, I would rebrand pretty quickly, because I think an awful lot of the public debate is based on the viewing these words and, the franking machine allowance and the switchboard allowance. And can you help me, I suppose, in relation to what is the franking machine allowance, who does it, and what exactly is the allowance for? Because I see that there's only 1.5 people in 2011 on the allowance, and the cost of the allowance has been €2,588. But it's all these kind of small little allowances that I think are actually dominating the public debate. And I think if we could have greater public understanding of what exactly the franking machine allowance or the switchboard allowance, that would be very helpful.
I mean, I have to preface what I say, by the way, that you appreciate that in this category of payment, the payments are sometimes, they apply to more than just the department, so that we're not in the drive, you understand that we're not in the driving seat. A franking machine is simply the machine that operates in the postal system. It franks the post on the way out, and the franking machine allowance is an allowance been along for a very long time. It was obviously introduced probably many years ago when franking machines were introduced, and somebody made a claim to the operating of a new form of technology, and somebody got a claim conceded. So that would be the explanation I would expect for that.
Yeah, I think it's going to be an issue that's going to come up right across the department, so we can deal with that as well. And just the final question I have is for Mr. Howard as well, in relation to the business cases that were put forward. I read an awful lot of the business cases, and again, I think in terms of branding, I think calling them business cases was possibly an overstatement in some regard. Are you in a position to offer me a view in relation to the quality of the process? I mean, again, and it is important because we've had a significant. We talk about the morale in the defence forces. We've had a significant amount, I suppose, of pressure and demoralisation within our public sector. And I think when you actually look at the quality of some of the business cases put forward, I mean, many that I read, they weren't business cases. They were basically, this is an allowance that has been in place. The removal of this allowance could result in industrial action. And that was the business case. I'm just wondering, I'm not sure it actually served the process well. I'm just wondering, in your view, in relation to the business cases that came in from your department or from allowances within your department, what your thinking on that would be.
I would be satisfied that given the extraordinary pressure that we were under, and I mean, one of the points I would ask the committee to bear in mind, we have limited resources in what we do, and we try to concentrate on them to follow the money. If you look at the global breakdown, I'm just going to use the global figures, at roughly 100 million in terms of allowances, so more than half of that goes on the military service allowance. We've discussed that. The bulk of what's left is taken up with the technician pay, with the security duty allowances. There are two types for Portage and the other, and overseas peace support allowances, which have been, reviewed in comparatively modern times. We'd identified those, and that is what we would put our analytic ability into. That's where the money is. That's where the focus of our attention would be. In relation to the others, I would have to say that I feel that we did the best job that we could under the time that is available. The point that I would make here is that 65 of these, that you could devote an excessive amount of time to research some allowances, which might not yield you a whole lot in terms of money. But I don't think that I would accept, I mean, obviously you're entitled to form your own view as to the quality of the business case made. I would say, having regard to what I know of the allowances, what I regard to the circumstances for which, my knowledge of the circumstances for which they were paid, I feel that the material submitted should have conveyed to anybody sufficient knowledge to make a decision in relation to them. And that was the purpose of the exercise. Given the very difficult situation that the country is in, exercises like this have to be completed very quickly, and that it is important that they are completed. And we were very proud of the fact that when we're given deadlines, we respond and we meet them. So I would perhaps gently but respectfully disagree with you, perhaps, on the quality of that.
You're entitled to do. Listen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and you're all very welcome to the committee this afternoon. I just want to ask a few specifics in relation to different specific allowances first, if I might, because you were talking there about archaic language, and there's a chaplain's housekeeper's allowance, 1,868 per year, and where in addition a maid servant is required, this is paid at €842 per year. I'm just intrigued by this. I see that 14 individuals are in receipt of this for their housekeeper or maid servant. Do you see that one, Mr.
I do indeed.
It's one of the 88 allowances.
Okay.
By the way, Chairman, if I may, just on a point of information,
Yeah.
I'm informed that there is no maidservant, that nobody's claimed that part of the allowance. Sorry, I beg your pardon. I am informed that the maidservant, it exists as a legacy allowance, but I'm informed that nobody's claiming in respect of a maidservant.
Yeah, for that. I'm greatly relieved by that. Of course, the allowance that got all the sort of the big publicity at the time, if you remember, was the underwear and night attire allowance for female personnel. And it's ironic when you drill into the detail and you see, well, if you were to abolish this outrageous payment for 377 recipients, you'd yield just under €13,000. So I think that best reflects how a level of sensationalism can sort of take a grip. I think it's very useful to have this information before us. But can I just say another dilemma that you have is that, you see, it makes no logical sense to pay a military service allowance to military people. Just follow my logic on this. no more than it serves any useful purpose to pay an allowance to pilots for flying, because that's what they do. And I think just perhaps this is a presentational point which I want to deal with first. The presentation of that is really important, because some of you have spoken about morale within the ranks, and it's very important that people, particularly serving in a military capacity with military discipline under a military command, who are exempted from basic things that other people take for granted, be it representation in the Congress of Trade Unions, coverage by the health and safety legislation, and so on and so forth, are actually protected by the system that they serve. And I mean that in the most positive of ways, because I think I agree with previous speakers. The naming of these allowances is misleading in its most benign way, but then is also very damaging to the reputation of the Defence Forces. So you've made an explanation, Mr. Howard, as to the history of this. I entirely accept that it was a hodgepodge arrangement, and I'm sure it was done with the very best of intentions. But I hope that it is now abundantly clear that this is not a situation that can continue into the future, because it cannot be logically or rationally explained. So there's archaic things there that need to be stripped out. And then more to the point, people have to be paid properly. I mean, I think the big revelation for lots of people, if they followed this part of our examination of allowances, is how poorly paid, for instance, privates are. I mean, they're absolutely scandalous. In any other sector, that would be viewed as slave wages. And it is, you know, not alone unacceptable, but very unwise for the state to pay people so poorly, for all the reasons that I think are evident, because of the nature of the tasks carried out by people, because we rely on them for our own security, because the security of the state hinges on the quality of service of people at every level. So, I mean, those levels of pay can't be stood over. And to say, when you've got deplorably low basic pay and then you supplement it with the military service allowance, you know, it just isn't an acceptable situation to pertain. I also want to address your issue, because I don't accept this thing of you know, the law of unintended consequences, or people jumping up and down and saying, well, an engineer in the army is getting X, I therefore have parity with that. I think, particularly in this sector, it's so self-evident why the Defence Forces are an exceptional case. And we've no difficulty making the exception in respect of some of the other areas that I've mentioned. It's very clear that the average worker in the public or civil service is not on call 24/7, except us in politics, just to, perhaps.
Just a few of us.
Some of us. You know, that they're not subjected to the rigours and the demands that military service entails. So I actually don't accept that, you know, either you had to go along in this manner historically, although you've explained that, or certainly that you should continue in this way because you're looking over your shoulder at other parts of the public sector. I just don't. I think that's badly conceived. I don't think it adds up. And I think, by any stretch, I think it's a very easy case to identify the exceptionality around the Defence Force. I think they're self-evident. Mr. Howard. Mr. Howard.
If I could respond to the first point, and not any great late in relation to the naming of allowances, I think we're all agreed, and I mean, obviously that's an issue we'll have to address going forward. I can only repeat what I've said, that at the time they were being named, great thought and attention would have gone into the conditions and who would get it and all the rest, but the naming of the allowance obviously was never a great issue, and probably those of us who work within a particular community like the Defence Organisation, talking to each other, maybe do sometimes lose sight of how a person who has no prior information would come to the situation. I accept that point entirely. Regarding the repercussive effects, again, I would have to respectfully and gently disagree with you, because the point I'm making is very much an observation of experience. While I agree entirely with the Deputy on the fact that the unique attributes of military life are self-evident, it is also a fact that, in my experience, you would be surprised at the ingenuity that, quite legitimately perhaps, trade union and representative associations put into watching what the other gets, and then seeking to use that as a lever to get more for themselves. So it is a response to something that was actually happening in terms of leapfrogging. And some groups within the public service were believed to have succeeded in catapulting their pay up the system by watching what other people get, and by perhaps being creative, if I can put it that way, in presenting why they should get some part of it themselves. So I would have to say that the fear and the concern was based on events that had happened. Now, it is some time back. I would emphasise we are in a vastly different place now. But during the 1990s and during the noughties, if that's what we call them, where there were centralised pay determination mechanisms, agreements, where there were things like benchmarking 1 and 2, there was a very real fear. Now, I emphasise this is national pay policy. I'm only responsible, I know, for what goes on in the defence domain. But there were links between the defence forces historically and certain key grades in the civil and public service. And at a very long time, going back more than a generation, there were links established between certain key marker grades in the civil and public service, and when they got increases, they almost automatically went elsewhere. So that in order to break that link, identifying the military service element and making it unique.
So not to cut across to Mr. Howard, where were those linkages historically between the military service and the civil and public service?
By the way, I emphasise at this point, Chairman, just in case I'm satisfied as to the general accuracy of what I'm saying, but I'm speaking now of my memory of events more than 20 years ago. For example, my recollection is that an awful lot of military personnel's pay moved in response to the EO and HEO grade in the civil service. Okay? Now, that grade was also used, I believe, as a marker for other groups around the system. So the fear was, if you did something for the defence forces, it could spill on to people who would say, hang on a minute, we were always linked to them, and then others further out the system would say, well, we were linked. Yeah. Now, I emphasise, I am describing the historical situation, but I just wanted everybody to be sure that there was actually an empirical basis for this concern, based on things that had happened.
Right, well, it's the net point, I suppose, being as follows. The state should not be underpaying people to the extent that it does, and then trying to take the bad look off it with the system of allowances that then come under pressure, that then in turn put the individuals and their families concerned under pressure. And what I would like to see is, and I do understand that all of this has to be negotiated out and debated amongst yourselves, and you're perhaps constrained in what you might say in this particular forum, but you need to find some kind of sustainable, fair pathway forward in terms of rewarding people, and circumstances where serving soldiers are reliant on family income supplement. And that actually wasn't news to me. I've met many of those families, and it is, I think, shocking, and I think it's not widely known that that is in fact the case. So when people talk about allowances, we need to straighten all of this out, you know, because it's anachronistic and it's clumsy and it's not good practice. But I think it's important to say in this forum that people need to be conscious when they're taking a cheap shot at an incidental allowance that they're talking about. It's important who's in receipt of those allowances. And when it's people who are vastly underpaid, we need to have that to the forefront of our minds. I would wonder if I might ask the representative organisations, perhaps starting with yourself, Colonel O'Keefe, just to give us some sense of how you envisage this matter. I know a section of these allowances are up for discussion and for negotiation, but I'm interested in a slightly longer term view from your perspective and the perspective of your members in respect of a fair, equitable transparent pay system that recognises the unique position of people in military service. If I could ask you, Colonel, to give your response to that, and then perhaps Mr Rooney on behalf of your members. Thank you.
As I said before, we will enter this review in a very positive way. We would look forward to it because these allowances cause us as much difficulties as other people. We've always contributed positively to things like this. I think how we get on will depend on the motivation of each side. If the objective is to save money by cutting people's pay, well then we're not, or pay package, well then we're not going to make much progress. If it's about rationalising the system and coming up with a more effective system for everyone, for the state and for our members, well then I think we will make very good progress. We would like to see the review carried out not by the official side and then them coming to us. We'd like to be part of that from the start, and we hope that we can achieve that.
Thank you.
I think it's a supposedly broadly similar position, and certainly I don't think that financially there's anything from our perspective to fear in the main. And there are some very anachronistic payments, but in the round they're well justified, and consolidation into pay or the pay system would be a positive thing. Not really the ideal environment to be doing it in, though I would have thought from a trade union or representative association process, but I think we've nothing to fear from it.
Okay. Finally, Mr Howard, how do you see that process unfolding? How inclusive will it be?
Obviously, we have to talk to the associations about how we will go about this. As the employer side, we will always seek to be as objective as we can about it. It would be remiss of me not to take up what Jerry Rooney has said, and to say that, of course, the management side is bound by whatever financial constraints the country's very desperate economic situation places upon us. Now, I do understand that we have a very good and a very open relationship with representative associations, but very often we find at the start of the process we may have very different points of view, and there may be quite a lengthy and robust but open process for us to go through with the associations. We have always found that the difficult situations we've had to deal with up to now, that nobody gains by anything other than an open and inclusive process. So how we go about setting that up is something we have to reflect on. We have to talk to the associations about. Obviously, I can't do that here today. But we would hope that at the end of whatever process it is, that we will make whatever progress we can. But I do have to reference the very difficult economic situations that the country is in, and that will have to form an important consideration in any review process.
Right, I think that's entirely appropriate, and of course the difficult circumstances that individuals and their families equally find themselves in. There is legislation around minimum wage. There are certain minimum thresholds below which nobody should fall, and I would very much hope that that would form a very clear part of the perspective and agenda of the state as you pursue those discussions.
Roughly how long do you anticipate that this process will take?
This is something that has been identified for the medium term, so that we will, in the task that lies immediately before us, on which we are now in process, is to address the issues that have arisen in the Croke Park Agreement. So we will have to address that. That would be the technicians' pay, the security duty allowance review and issues like that, so that, and the other allowances that are the subject of a government decision. So we would have to go through that process first.
You would regard that as a short-term process, the initial areas,
We've
then
been
the
asked to
broader
address
review
them,
is a medium-term process.
Yeah, we have been asked to address that as a matter of some urgency.
Okay.
I want to go back to a theme there that Deputy Harris just touched on briefly there, which is the difference between an allowance and an expense, and to maybe suggest this is something that we should be refining and having in mind in our report here. Deputy O'Donnell picked up on the point there regarding the equitation school. I'm afraid I left briefly, so I apologise for hearing your response back. But, around 6 months ago, I had the privilege of visiting McKee Barracks, visiting the equitation school, and seeing what a wonderful facility it is and the work that it does. And there's an allowance here, number 59, which is a special uniform allowance, which is officers of or attached to the equitation school. But this kind of illustrates the point to me because, like, when I met these officers, they were wearing different uniforms because they do different kinds of work to the other officers that are there. But they're getting paid this allowance, but they're not benefiting from the allowance, at least from what I saw anyway, because they're wearing, that allowance goes into purchasing different equipment or uniform to other people that I met. And is this not part of what we have to kind of, so sorry, that is me. Is this not part of what we have to kind of really refine down on, that there is amidst all of the different criteria here of core pay versus non-core pay, there's also the issue here of an allowance versus an expense, which they're fundamentally different things.
So if I may, that's one of the big learnings we will take away from the committee for ourselves is the importance of the public communications element of it. And I would very strongly agree with you that it is important that we do classify clearly in people's minds what is income or remuneration and what is simply an expense, because to describe an expense allowance as if it is some sort of benefit to the individual is actually not factually accurate, because it is simply, as you said, a case where people, for administrative convenience, are allowed in the equitation school to buy safety helmets, boots and stuff like that, and are given away. So I would take the point entirely.
Just to conclude with another example of this, like the entertainment allowance, which is listed here, and I've got a selection of the business cases listed, printed out here in front of me. For 7 claims in 2011. But like, I have to assume if this money is being used, it is being used to cover money that has been spent for a particular purpose, as opposed to giving a pecuniary benefit to the individual who's using it. So like I saw somewhere, and I can't find it now because there's so many sheets here. I've got it here. Yeah, the Principal Military Appointments Entertainment Allowance. So I think it's another great example of this. So each commanding officer of a naval vessel has an entertainment allowance of €200 per annum, which is to cover the purchase of goods necessary for any kind of entertainment. So I imagine this is where one of our vessels here is on a foreign shore. They host some kind of a reception. Somebody comes on board, and as sometimes the case with us, you're given something to recognise the event. But that allowance is covering off the purchase of an item. So correct me if I'm right or wrong here. So nobody is benefiting from that allowance, apart from the person who shot the thing that's been bought in. But
okay.
That's it.
The deputy is entirely
That's one
right.
of the 11.
It is, yeah.
Listen, okay, sorry. Okay. But it's just that broad point, though, the difference between an allowance and expense.
Yeah. Well, the deputy is entirely right, and I mean some of the allowances of an expense nature are vouched. Some of them are paid on a, if you like, for administrative convenience, maybe paid on a flat rate, based on a calculation of whatever the expense is. But the fact is,
it's a reimbursement. So
yes,
but it should be classified as an expense rather than an allowance.
Yeah, and the deputy is entirely correct. But the
But
trouble is,
they're not.
for legacy
They're not.
reasons,
They're
yes,
not.
a vouched allowance can, a vouched expense may be described as an allowance. And again, I know I'm repeating myself. You know, when this was being set up years ago, nobody foresaw the discussion or the issue of principle that it could turn into. And the system operated for many years, and nobody paid any attention to the naming of it.
Any further questions? Do PDFORRA or Rachel want to add anything to what's been said? Okay. Well, by way of concluding the meeting, I want to thank all of the witnesses for attending. I suppose we set out this morning with some concern as to how this meeting might work out, because the accounting officer is here and the 2 representative organisations are here, and we didn't want to get into a situation where we were interfering with the negotiations or beginning to negotiate publicly in relation to the allowances. The meeting that we had earlier on with the Secretary General of the Department was most helpful also. And if I can describe how helpful that was, because some of the members have commented on it, and indeed the meeting here, is that there's a mystery about this which is, I think, grossly misunderstood, and relates to how the allowances are described, what they're for, and in the case of the Defence Forces, the poor pay, and the fact that some of it is core pay, and then, you know, and so on. And if the process that we've entered into this morning helps to take some of that mystery away and encourages those that are negotiating to a point where they see that the public want to understand just exactly what's going on and who's being paid what, how good or bad people are being paid. They can make a better judgment call on it. If you can't reach an agreement on what is to be paid, well then, if you just clarify all of this for the public, for us and for the public, it will be a huge help, a huge help. And I think that you can take from the conversation this morning that, and again going back to your negotiations, if they can be as open and as constructive as this exchange was this morning, I think it will be most helpful to reaching some sort of a positive conclusion on it for those that serve and those that administer, and for us on the Public Accounts Committee, representing the public in terms of that greater understanding of what's going on. Finally, I would say that Deputy Donoghue raised the point about the different questions and therefore the table that emerged from those questions. You know, I suppose that table emerged because of the questions that were put by the clerk and the officials of the committee, which gave us a greater understanding. And that too was helpful. And I would hope that the other accounting officers and the other organisation represent those groups that represent, you know, whether it's unions or whatever, would have looked in at this meeting, because there's a lot to be learned in terms of the very positive exchanges that can take place at a Public Accounts Committee and how helpful those exchanges can be to not just this process, but the other processes that will go on afterwards. It was, I think, a very positive exchange of information that will be helpful to everybody. And I want to thank you for that, and to thank the members who did the homework and put the questions and extracted the information in a way that was constructive and helpful. So thank you very much for attending this morning. Meeting stands adjourned on 23rd of